40 years ago, a movie opened that didn't have spaceships. It didn't have superheroes. It didn't have giant special effects. It was basically four kids walking down some railroad tracks looking for a dead body. And somehow, 40 years later, we're still talking about Stand By Me. But when I think about Stand By Me, I don't just remember the movie. I remember the lines. Actual lines. People standing outside a movie theater waiting to get in. Because in 1986, I was working as an usher at the United Artists Theater in Smithtown, New York. And when Stand By Me played there, we had lines around the block. Not just opening night, for weeks. You have to remember what going to the movies was like in 1986. Our theater had one screen. That's it. One. There wasn't a 16-screen multiplex where Stand By Me could be playing every 30 minutes in 3 different auditoriums. There was one screen and a limited number of seats. There were no online ticket purchases. There was no app. You couldn't reserve seat G12 from your couch 3 days before the movie. You showed up, you bought a ticket, and you hoped you got there early enough to get a decent seat. Because if you didn't, welcome to the front row. And I'm talking about the old-fashioned front row, the kind where you're practically underneath the screen. You didn't watch the movie, you looked up at it for 2 hours. And if the show was sold out, now you had another decision to make. Go home or wait 2 hours or more for the next showing. And people waited. That's what I remember. Week after week, people kept coming to see this movie. And when you're an usher, you get a very different perspective on whether a movie is connecting with people. You're cleaning the theater between shows. You're watching people come out. You're watching the next crowd line up. You're hearing people talk about the movie before they've even made it out the door. And sometimes, we'd actually go backstage and watch the audience. There was one scene we especially loved doing this for, the pie eating contest. If you've seen Stand By Me, you know exactly where this is going. Lard-ass Hogan, the blueberry pies, the castor oil, and then complete chaos. We'd sneak backstage and watch the audience during that scene, and it was incredible. The entire theater would be laughing. Not polite little laughs. The room would erupt. Then the vomiting would start. And suddenly you'd have hundreds of people laughing, groaning, covering their mouths, turning away from the screen, and looking like they were about 2 seconds away from joining in. We were watching people laugh and almost vomit at the same time. And naturally, as ushers, we thought this was fantastic. Although looking back, encouraging an entire sold-out theater to nearly throw up probably wasn't the smartest thing for the people responsible for cleaning the auditorium. Which, of course, was us. But that's what I remember about that movie. The audience reacted to it, together. And that's something that's difficult to recreate when you're watching a movie at home. A packed theater has its own personality. One person starts laughing, then another. Then suddenly, the entire room goes. And Stand By Me could do that. But here's what made the movie special. It could take that same audience that was practically gagging from laughter during the pie-eating contest and completely turn them around. Because by the end of the movie, those same people were crying. And when you think about it, this wasn't exactly the obvious recipe for a huge crowd pleaser. The movie was based on Stephen King's novella, The Body. Rob Reiner directed it, and the cast was mostly young actors. Will Wheaton, River Phoenix, Corey Feldman, Jerry O'Connell. 4 kids heading out to find the body of a missing boy. That's the plot. But that's not really what Stand By Me is about. It's about that strange period of your life when your friends are basically your entire world. Before jobs, before mortgages, before families, before everybody starts moving in different directions. When you're 12 years old, walking somewhere with your friends can feel like the most important adventure that's ever happened. And that's something I think changes when you watch Stand By Me as you get older. When I saw those crowds in 1986, I was watching a movie about 4 kids. Today, I'm not sure that's the movie I see anymore. Now I understand the adult Gordie, Richard Dreyfuss sitting at his computer, looking back at something that happened when he was 12 years old. He's not really telling us about finding a body. He's remembering his friends. And when we watched audiences leave that theater in 1986, you could see that connection. People laughed through the movie. They laughed at Vern. They laughed at Teddy. They laughed at the pie-eating contest. But toward the end, everything changed. You could see people wiping their eyes. Corey Feldman's Teddy was funny and wild, but underneath all of that was this damaged kid desperately defending a father who had hurt him. Will Wheaton's Gordie was carrying the pain of losing his brother and believing his parents almost wished it had been him instead. And then there was River Phoenix, Chris Chambers. That was the one. When adult Gordie tells us what eventually happened to Chris, you could feel the theater change. The kid we'd just spent the movie getting to know, the one who protected Gordie, the one who believed Gordie could become a writer, the kid who seemed tougher than everybody else, was gone, and people cried. I watched it happen. The same audience that we'd watched nearly lose their lunch during the pie scene was leaving the theater wiping tears from their eyes. That's a pretty incredible journey for one movie to take an audience on. And 40 years later, that Chris Chambers scene carries even more weight, because now we know what happened to River Phoenix. Phoenix was only 23 when he died in 1993, so watching Chris disappear from Gordie's life has another layer today, one that nobody sitting in our theater in 1986 could possibly have known. River walks away. He fades from the screen, and today it's difficult not to think about the young actor himself. Movies have this strange ability to freeze people in time. River Phoenix will always be there, young, still Chris, still walking those railroad tracks. And maybe that's part of why Stand By Me feels different as we get older. There's a line at the end that probably means more to me now than it ever could have in 1986. I never had any friends later on like the ones I had when I was 12. That's the movie. Everything else is the adventure that gets us there. Because people disappear from your life, not necessarily because something terrible happens. Life just happens. You graduate, somebody moves, somebody gets married, somebody takes a job somewhere else, and eventually, somebody who was once part of almost every day of your life becomes somebody you haven't spoken to in 30 years. And Stand By Me understood that. There's another thing that's almost amusing watching the movie today. The entire adventure depends on 4 kids being able to disappear for basically an entire day. Imagine that now. 4 12-year-olds announce they're going camping and vanish. The movie lasts 15 minutes. Find My iPhone says they're by the railroad tracks. Roll credits. But beneath all of the nostalgia is something that hasn't aged at all. Friendship, fear, parents who don't understand you, feeling like you're not good enough, wondering what you're going to become, and slowly realizing childhood isn't going to last forever. Stephen King reportedly had an emotional reaction when he first watched the completed movie, and I understand why. Because Stand By Me doesn't really feel like somebody telling you a story. It feels like somebody remembering one. There's a difference. And maybe that's why those lines wrapped around our theater in Smithtown. People weren't coming because Stand By Me had spectacular effects. There wasn't a franchise attached to it. Nobody was waiting for the post-credit scene teasing Stand By Me 2. People told other people about it, and those people came. Then they told somebody else. That's how movies could grow in 1986. Word of mouth. You couldn't go online and see what everybody thought 10 minutes after the first screening. A movie could slowly become something. And from my little position inside that theater, that's exactly what I watched happen. One screen, one movie, show sells out, people wait, next show sells out, and it keeps happening. 40 years later, I think about those people standing outside. I wonder how many of them were teenagers. How many were there with their best friends? How many of those friends are still part of their lives today? And how many would watch Stand By Me now and realize they're no longer watching the kids, they're watching Richard Dreyfuss. They're the person remembering. That's what 40 years does to a movie. The movie doesn't change. We do. In 1986, Stand By Me was about 4 boys going on an adventure. 40 years later, I think it's about looking back and realizing how quickly that part of your life disappeared. And maybe that's why people still love it. Because somewhere in almost everybody's life, there was a Gordie, a Chris, a Teddy, a Vern. There was a summer. There was a place you went. There was something stupid you did. And there were friends you were absolutely certain would be standing next to you forever. Then life happened. For me, Stand By Me will always have another memory attached to it. I'll remember being an usher at that little United Artists Theater in Smithtown. I'll remember that one screen. I'll remember the crowds. I'll remember people getting there late and discovering their choices were the front row or waiting another 2 hours. I'll remember sneaking backstage with the other ushers during the pie-eating contest, watching an entire theater laugh and gag together. And I'll remember those same people at the end. The laughter was gone. People were wiping their eyes because they understood Gordie. They understood Teddy. And especially, they understood Chris. But there's something else I've been thinking about while putting this video together. Those other ushers, the people I worked with, the people I stood backstage with watching that pie-eating scene. We were friends. We worked together. We laughed together. We probably complained about cleaning up the same spilled popcorn together. For that little period of our lives, we saw each other all the time. And you know what? I haven't talked to some of them in probably 30 years. I don't even know where some of them are today. Life happened. We left the theater. We got different jobs. People moved. People got married. People had families. And somewhere along the way, we just lost touch. Which suddenly makes this movie feel a little more personal than I expected it to. Because that's Stand By Me. It's not really about 4 kids walking down railroad tracks. It's about the people who walk beside us for a little while and then aren't there anymore. Not because anybody did anything wrong. Life just kept moving. At the time, I was just an usher working at a movie theater. I didn't know I was watching a movie become a classic. And I certainly didn't know that 40 years later, I'd be sitting here remembering the people I worked with while we showed it. Maybe that's what this movie is really good at. It makes you remember people. So maybe I'll take my own advice. Maybe after I finish this video, I'll see if I can find a couple of those old ushers. Send a message. Say hello. See how they're doing. Maybe they'll remember standing backstage watching people nearly lose their lunch during the pie-eating scene. Maybe they won't. But after 30 years, it might be nice just to check in. And maybe there's somebody like that in your life too. Somebody who was once part of almost every day and somehow became somebody you haven't spoken to in years. Maybe Stand By Me is a pretty good excuse to look them up. So here's what I want to know. When did you first see Stand By Me? And when you watch it today, does it feel like the same movie you remember? Or has the movie changed? Because you have. Because I have a feeling a lot of us aren't watching Gordie and his friends anymore. We're sitting at the computer with Richard Dreyfuss, remembering ours. And 40 years later, I think I finally understand exactly what that means. Thanks for watching The Geek and I. And if you'll excuse me, I think I have a couple of old friends to look up.